thinking better and thinking together about life's most important issues. A place to finally meet in the middle, to think freely and reasonably about the big questions of life. This is Thinker Sensitive. Welcome back to the weekly on Thinker Sensitive. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving break. Today's episode will be the first part of an interview with a special guest, Chad Graham. If you don't know, Chad is actually the original founder of Thinker Sensitive. Before we get into the interview, let me provide some background and fill in some history. Chad and I went to the same college in the Dallas, Texas area, though we didn't attend the school at the same time. We met at a theological forum that was created by some of the students on campus. It was a place where students could ask difficult questions in an open and safe environment. That forum, in one way or another, probably had a direct impact on the development of Thinker Sensitive. Chad and I used to stay later, long after the event was over, and debate and discuss issues that, honestly, we probably don't even care that much about anymore. It was through those conversations, though, through those arguments and debates, that Chad and I became friends. In some ways, a lot of the values of Thinker Sensitive were born out of those conversations. Base openness, tolerance, ethical disagreement, civil discourse, critical thinking, thoughtfulness, and many, many others. After college, we lost contact for a bit. Chad started a pretty successful theology blog/website called One Theology that I was a regular contributor on. But other than that, we didn't cross paths much. We both went off to grad school with aspirations to be professors, but neither of us actually ended up going the traditional education route. Chad graduated from Denver Seminary, and I graduated from Asbury Theological Seminary. We both found ourselves in the state of Colorado after graduation. Chad was helping to support a church plant in Denver, and I was starting a house church in Colorado Springs. Soon, by a twist of fate or divine providence, we ended up in the same city again, as Chad moved down to Colorado Springs to plant his own church. During that time, Chad recruited me to come help him out at the church he was starting. If you know anything about Chad, you know he is a difficult guy to say no to, so I begrudgingly accepted. While I was there, he introduced me to a project that he was working on called Thinker Sensitive, and the rest is history. So without further ado, let's bring on Chad Graham. Chad, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Excited to be here.
So I want to start off today's interview with some questions about your personal journey and personal story. So what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in a single mother household, and I grew up in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. So I kind of grew up in white suburbia, went to public school, had a sister named Lacey. She's still a big part of my life, big part of my family. Her and my mom live in Texas now. But my life growing up was a suburban kid life, except for my father passed away when I was 7. And so my mom raised my sister and I as a single mom, and we had some family issues, I'll say, that kind of led to a wily youth. I definitely had a misspent youth. I was kind of into drugs, and I was into partying and getting into trouble. Definitely didn't take school very seriously. So I had kind of a crazy later childhood, early adolescent period. But God radically changed that in my teenage years. So,
Now, did you grow up in a religious home or in a home that emphasized the importance of big questions or the importance of philosophy? And did you grow up going to church?
so my mom is a Christian and grew up in a Christian home. But technically, my grandmother was Christian and my grandfather believed in Jesus, but he didn't ever go to church regularly. So my mom grew up going to church. She didn't really have us going to church growing up until I was starting to become a teenager. And then she'd kind of send me with my grandmother and my aunt on like big holidays, or, sometimes it'd be the occasional streak of 4 or 5 Sundays that we would go, and then, long periods of time in between. So I didn't really grow up churched at all.
Okay. So when did you become a Christian then? When did you convert to Christianity, or when did you have an experience that kind of changed your life and changed your personal journey?
Yeah. So it's kind of a multi-part story. When I was 16, I robbed a bookstore, and that when I got arrested for that, I was put on a 2-year probation period and had to do quite a bit of community service hours, and really had a scare in terms of, I was confronted with where my life was headed. And I went to an alternative high school. I dropped out of high school and went to an alternative high school where I met an English teacher named Doug Talbert was his name. And he was a person who studied English, but also had degrees in philosophy. And so he had me reading a lot of different philosophical works. He introduced me to Friedrich Nietzsche. He introduced me to Aristotle. He introduced me to Plato. He introduced me to a lot of the philosophers, and that got me thinking about some of the bigger questions of life. And then as part of my community service hours, I had to do them somewhere in the local community, and my grandmother insisted that I do them at her church. And so I petitioned the youth pastor there and asked him if he could allow me to do my hours there at the church. And he kind of took me under his wing and treated me like a special project, and really made sure that I was put in situations frequently where I would hear the gospel message presented. I would be interacting with other Christians my age. And through that relationship, I came to know Christ. I came to understand what it means to be kind of adopted into the family of God. But I track my salvation moment actually when I went to Bible college. I was not headed to college at all, but he actually, the youth pastor there, Jim Terry was his name, he put me in the youth choir because he knew that the youth choir at that particular church performed really well in something called Fine Arts, which is like a national talent show for youth groups. And he knew that this year it was likely that the choir would win nationals and therefore get awarded college scholarships. And so he put me in the back row and told me I wasn't allowed to really sing. I had to just kind of lip sync it. And we ended up winning nationals, and that got me a scholarship to Southwestern Assemblies of God University. And so all of a sudden I had money to go to college, and I had someone helping me get there. And that's actually where I ended up accepting Christ as my Lord and Savior in my first year of college there.
That's really cool. Now, how did your sense of calling develop? Was there a moment in your personal journey where you felt like God was calling you down a specific road or down a specific path?
Yeah, so that's been kind of a complicated question for me. When I went to college, I was the first one in my family to go to college, so I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have any clue how to like build a schedule, how to sequence coursework, that kind of thing. So I ended up stacking all of my coursework on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I like went to school for like 12 hours on those days, and then I had 4-day weekends. And so my first semester in college was terrible. I didn't do very well academically. I really set myself up for failure. And I was a declared counseling major at the time. And the reason I chose that is I went through some counseling during the process of my probation period, and it really changed my life and helped me understand why I did some of the things that I did. And I wanted to provide that service and help others in that way. And so it didn't take long, though, in my first semester for me to realize that even though I benefited from counseling, I'm not much of a counselor. So I actually took the next semester, I took some church history courses, and I took a theology course with a man named Bruce Rosedal, and he helped guide me to a theological studies major. And that's when I kind of felt like maybe God was calling me to study theology and philosophy at a deeper level. Maybe I would go into teaching, or really at that point I only knew I needed to study the theology and philosophy at the deepest levels I could. And so I spent some time doing that academically. I joined the different theological and philosophical societies. I tried to engage in philosophical meetups in the Dallas area for a while. There was a philosophers group that met there. And so anywhere I could, I tried to engage theological circles and philosophical circles while I earned my degrees and worked in various accounting settings to provide for me and my wife, Stephanie, who I met at Bible college and married when I was 21. So we really, early on, didn't know what exactly the calling would be, but I've always been deeply drawn to theology and philosophy. So I've tried to do things that line up with learning, growing, teaching, engaging theology and philosophy ever since my conversion, really.
Yeah. So, Chad, you talked a little bit about your experience at SAGU, which was the Bible college that you attended and the Bible college that I attended as well. Overall, what was your experience like attending a Pentecostal Bible college?
Yeah, so it was a little bit strange for me in that I didn't have much church background when I went. A lot of my peers had grown up in church, had really had a church background to kind of undergird this experience. In a lot of ways, I would hear my friends describe SAGU as kind of an extension of their youth group, in a sense where they felt like, it was a safe place to be. There was a lot of the same rules and guidelines they would find in their home church. And for me, it was just very different because I had lived in a situation where I had a lot of freedom. I wasn't really, I wasn't raised in a holiness tradition. And so it wasn't, common knowledge for me how to really behave in a holiness Pentecostal setting. And so, speaking in tongues and living a very strict moral life and really obeying scripture almost in literal terms sometimes was kind of a difficult thing for me to do, just because I didn't have that training and I didn't have that background. And in some ways it led to some bitterness because I thought it was very legalistic and I thought it was very oppressive. It was like just difficult to fit in there. But in a lot of ways, even looking back, now that I'm not a student there anymore, I met professors who changed my life. I met my wife there. It really was a safe and healthy place for me to grow theologically and get some bearings on, who God is, what the Bible is, what the history of Christianity looked like. And while I was going through it, I didn't probably appreciate it enough. And now looking back, I appreciate it a lot more. And it still has some of the pitfalls that, that I identified as a student. But I have a fondness now for SAGU that's been lasting. So.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience at SAGU, felt the same way in a lot of ways that you were just describing. At the same time, I met my wife at SAGU. I met some great mentors at SAGU, like Dr. Rosedal.
Yep.
And I also met you at SAGU.
Yeah.
And I met you at SAGU in a theological forum. It was called The Forum.
Yeah.
So tell us about your experience there.
Yeah. So I was there at the original forum meeting. It was interesting. It actually was kind of a composition of theological studies majors, biblical study majors who wanted a more official kind of school sanctioned place to come together and debate and theorize and philosophize on certain topics. And SAGU really didn't have a club that embodied that fully. And so Dr. Rosedahl, along with several students like Rob Reed, who's no longer with us, passed away a few years back, and Brandon Hester and John Hefner and several other guys got together, Chris Taylor, Joel Tyler. We got together and started basically a student group on campus where we would discuss theological topics, philosophical topics sometimes. And that's really where I fell in love with bringing theology and philosophy into everyday conversations and into everyday life, because there'd be students there who were nerds like us who are really into theology and philosophy, but there would also be students sometimes show up and want to hear a rigorous debate on, human sexuality or the nature of free will or some of these deeper theological discussions that you wouldn't really get in a classroom setting. And it was all, peer to peer. And so it was just really fun to be able to hear and argue and debate in a friendly way, but certainly in a heated and passionate way with friends. And so I look back on the forum as a pivotal institution in my life.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. I wanted to ask you a question about One Theology, which was the website or blog that you started in theology and in philosophy. And you got it to a point where there were actually a lot of people who were subscribed, a lot of people followed it, and it was very lively. Tell us a little bit about how you started it and why you started it.
Yeah, so the forum, after I had graduated and after I'd kind of moved on from SAGU, I found myself missing the theological dialogue and the community, doing theology and community aspect that was present on campus and in the forum. And so, through an extended period of time at SAGU, I didn't do the traditional 4 years. I was there closer to 7 years because I took a break in the middle, but still stayed connected to the campus through work. I had met just so many different theological studies majors and biblical studies majors who could write well, could express ideas, who wanted to engage in theological discourse in the intersection of culture and politics and things like that. So kind of my voyage into blogging was getting all my friends back together on a group blog and basically putting together a schedule and getting people to write on a schedule about different theological and philosophical topics that intersected with culture and politics and various other disciplines. And, it ended up turning into something pretty cool. I didn't really ever intend on it growing to the point that it did. But by the time, it was probably at its peak, we had about 24 people writing for the blog, and we had a lot of subscriptions, and we were, just about ready to monetize it with ads and all sorts of different things. So yeah, it was kind of like my post undergrad project to keep theology and philosophy as a center point in my life where I could still engage with my friends, with people I really care about, and really talk about what's going on in the world theologically and philosophically.
Yeah, it was a really cool site, and it was great to be a part of it for sure. So why did you decide to attend seminary, and particularly Denver Seminary?
Yeah. So that road, again, was a journey for me. It took me a while to go to seminary. I started seminary when I was 29. I felt like the Lord was calling me to continue to pursue theology and philosophy vocationally. I still didn't know if that was going to be teaching or pastoring or Since I had done one theology and done a little bit of podcasting, I thought maybe there was a third party approach also that could happen, like a parachurch ministry approach that would work for me. And so I was really drawn to try to find a good, solid seminary that offered a philosophy of religion degree. And Denver Seminary offered that. And I went and toured the campus and met some professors, and Craig Blomberg, New Testament scholar, was there, and Danny Carroll, Old Testament scholar, was there. And so I was really drawn to the school for its firepower. And Doug Grotice, who was the department chair of philosophy there, was also a major draw. And by the time I actually enrolled and started going there as a student, the degree changed, but we had moved our family and we had already decided to go there, and it just made sense for us to continue going. And so I didn't get a philosophy of religion degree. They changed the title to apologetics and ethics. So it still was roughly the same course material. It just had a different name by the time I got there and completed my degree. So I wanted to go there because I wanted to really deal with philosophical issues. I wanted to deal with ethics. I wanted to also continue writing on the intersection of theology and politics. And this was a school that really was equipped to handle that and help me with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then what led you to go into church ministry right after seminary?
That's a good question. Really, I was mentored to by Dr. Rosedahl, and one of his big pushes throughout my undergrad was, whenever you're going to school, whether it be undergrad, graduate degrees, or whatever, it's really important to be plugged into the local church. And I saw so many of my friends fall away during the educational process because they never really got out. They never continued to engage in fellowship with Christians. They tended to just get really deep into the academic side of things. And so I tried to live by that. I tried to, offer my gifts and what I could give to the local church while I did seminary. And I happened to try out a church plant in my hometown of Highland Ranch while I was going to Denver Seminary. They were like 15 minutes apart, the seminary and the church. And so I ended up working at that church plant for 3 years while I was going to seminary for 3 years. And when I graduated, it was just natural for me to stay in the church world because I had accumulated church contacts. I had been ordained through the Assemblies of God. I had been on the track of building a pastoral resume. I had served. My first real pastoral position was an executive pastor position because of my banking and finance background. And so I had a pretty good leg up on pastoral ministry at that point when I graduated. And so I was kind of confronted with this fork in the road. Am I going to go on and continue and get my PhD, or am I going to take a break from academics and pursue pastoral ministry vocationally? And my wife and I decided, because we had young children at the time and school was just so difficult to work and go to school and make time for family, that we needed to take a little break and do pastoral ministry. And I've been in it ever since.
So why did you start Thinker Sensitive, and why did you give up on it and pass it off to me?
I like how you phrase that, as give up on it. I didn't give up on it. I started Thinker Sensitive because, as a podcast and a blog, because I was doing ministry in Colorado Springs, where you're at, and I thought that, church planting there and ministering to college students needed a digital discipleship component. You can throw events, you can bring food in, you could try to get college students to your building as much as possible, and that is never going to be as much engagement as sending out free resources via podcast that they can listen to on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music, those things now. So I just knew that if we were going to help disciple college students, young adults, that we needed to break into a podcast platform. And so that was my desire, is to talk about life's most difficult topics through podcasting and through interviewing experts and talking to my friends who had been seminary trained and who had thought through some of life's most difficult questions. I also wanted a place where we could talk about social issues and, again, the intersection of theology and politics and public life. And so we tried to do interviews with local business owners, with government officials, with people who had to live out ethics in the public sphere. And when the church I was on staff at and planted, when our time there was done, you and I were such a part of, I really felt like you and I were the DNA of the podcast, even though we had guests and we'd had other people involved in it as well, that I just wanted to see it go on. I think it's a great project. I think it's, helped a lot of people think through life's most difficult topics, and I want to see it continue. And so I'm happy to see that, man, you've really taken it to the next level. We never did half the podcasting you've done, and you're such a thoughtful guy, Ryan, and you've really thought through some great series. And I'm so glad to see, the reader or the listenership continues to grow and the sponsors continue to grow. And I think it's great, man.
Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. I'm just joking with you when I say you gave up on it.
I know you are.
So since graduating seminary, I believe you're now serving in your fourth church staff position. Is that right?
Well, so when I graduated seminary, I graduated in May, and we moved to Colorado Springs in May and planted UA. So I worked there for 3 years, and then I had a short stint in Aurora, Colorado at High Point Church. Was there for about 8 months during COVID. That was just a really difficult season for a number of reasons, but mainly, COVID is just kind of wrecked shop on the church overall. And so we decided to make a move from there. So I'm actually at my third church position.
Gotcha.
At Timber Creek Fellowship. Yeah. So we're at Timber Creek Fellowship in Norman, Oklahoma, and we're loving it here, and really, really have planted some roots, and I've bought a farm here. And so we're trying to make it work here in Norman.
That's awesome. So what I was going to ask you is, and this is a tough question, what have you learned about church ministry during all this time and during your experience? And what have you learned about yourself during this time?
Yeah, that's a big question. When you sent me this question ahead of time, and I was thinking through, I think if I boiled it down to one thing that I've learned, is that the church as an organization is never going to be successful if it drifts too far away from the command of Christ to make disciples. So the organization of the church in all of its different forms and all of its different cultural contexts and all of that never can get too far away from the mandate to teach disciples of Christ what he taught and what he commanded and how to obey those commands. And that takes relationship, that takes investment, that takes really intentional commitment, relationships. It takes training, it takes resources, it takes so much. And so I think I would say, one of the things I've learned is that for all of the gimmicks and all the different strategies that are out there for church growth and maximizing your reach and all of those kind of businessy terms, it really boils down to making disciples where you're at and investing in relationships with those people around you in your church community, and doing that in a very real way where you have people in your home and you have people in your life, and you really grow as a community because there's an authentic bond and an intentional commitment to one another. And that's really hard to live out. That's probably why church planting is so hard. It's why most churches don't make it very far or have a very long life. Is it's really hard to do life together in the way our culture is set up. And so maybe that's too broad of an answer for you, but that's probably the most salient thing that I've realized is working in the church is still fundamentally making disciples.
No, that's really good. That's a great answer. You touched on this a bit. Tell us what life looks like for you right now.
Yeah, right now, oh man. So right now I am executive pastor at the church. So I'm over the operations of the church. I help manage the staff. I help organize our ministry calendar and kind of keep all of our events and discipleship initiatives on track. I work with a great team of pastors and staff members who are, some of them have lived in Norman for 38 years. Some of them have, really grown up here, gone to the schools here, and so they're deeply embedded in the community. And this is OU territory. I don't know if you know that, but Oklahoma University is here in Norman, and so the college has a huge impact on the culture in the town, and has an impact on our ministry. Like our rhythms on Sunday are really tied to the football schedule, which is interesting. But really, life looks like being part of the Norman community here. My wife and I purchased a dilapidated family farm because I'm a nut, and you remember when I told you when I was living in Aurora and you were back on my deck and I said, I'm going to go buy a farm somewhere?
I do.
Do you remember that? Yeah. And I did it. And it's been a crazy ride, but, so we kind of bought this dilapidated farm and we've been slowly restoring it and tearing old buildings down and restoring some old buildings and, building fence work out. And our hope is to have some cattle, and, we've already started the groundwork for gardening. And, so pastoring and gardening and farming in this little Oklahoma town is what my life looks like.
That's really cool, and I'm hoping to come visit you soon.
Yes.
So what does the future hold for Chad Graham?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know what the future holds. I have no intention on leaving this community. I really love it here. I love us, trying to build a lifestyle that's slowed down a bit. I've always lived in big cities, and I've been part of, some bigger churches, and just, I've always been a guy who's going, part of a lot of different things. And over the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a process of just slowing down a bit, thinking about what I eat and what I consume and what my impact on the earth is, and how to structure a family and how to do family discipleship. And I'm just really loving this part of life. I'm 36 right now, and I couldn't be happier with where I am with my marriage, with my kids, with my family, and with my community. And so my hope is that I'm here doing this, making disciples in Norman for many years to come.
That's really cool to hear. I'm happy for you, Chad.
Thanks, man.
Let's shift our attention and our conversation to Thinker Sensitive for a bit. Why do you think a podcast like Thinker Sensitive is important today?
I think it's important today because the conversations that maybe were happening in church a few decades ago, and I primarily mean, apologetic conversations about theology building, conversations about how to integrate theological and philosophical thinking into everyday life. Those conversations over the period of the seeker-sensitive movement and kind of the more commercialization of the church have really faded. And so I think, a lot of people are supplementing their church life experience with podcasts and parachurch ministry resources because they're not getting the full diet in their churches. And so I think it's a valuable resource in that sense. I also think it's a valuable resource in that pastors, lay leaders, elders, staff members of churches need to have resources on the topics that you outline and you discuss for them to understand and them to think through and reason through. We need to be able to have resources that we can go to and think through and listen to how others reason through it. and then bring those good ideas to the community that we're at. So even the churches that don't do it, it's good resources for the people who need that in their diet. And then the churches that want to bring it into their local context and their discipleship planning, they have resources to go to and really listen and bring stuff into the church. And so, Ryan, I think you're creating valuable resources for the church today.
Well, thank you. That's a really good answer. Why or why not should modern people care about issues of ethics, philosophy, and theology?
Yeah, I think those things just never go away. I don't think people are reading introductory books to philosophy and theology. I don't think people are going to a bookstore. Do people even go to bookstores anymore? I do because I'm a weirdo, but I don't think the people en masse are reading those kind of introductory works to try to get a framework to think theologically or philosophically. But people are really engaged on social media and different cultural contexts, platforms to talk about the ethics of transgenderism or the ethics of the money that we spend on fossil fuels or issues related to the public school system. We still argue and wrestle with the ethics and the even theological underpinnings of these issues. We just don't do it in the most formal ways anymore. And so, as we get sick of our candidates, presidential candidates, maybe even local government candidates, as we grow tired of our public institutions eroding, what our kids are learning or aren't learning in school, I think it's going to be important for us to always remember that we're going to have to go back and continue to develop our understanding of philosophy, theology, ethics, these important topics that of study that you raise, because we're human, because these problems never really go away. They just find new adaptations and they present themselves in new social ills and social responsibilities and family rearing and things like that. So these are the issues of life. I don't think there's any escaping them.
Do you think contemporary people are still interested in the big questions?
I think they are. They just don't necessarily frame them as the big questions. I think people are still, generally aware of, that there's something either guiding all of history or there's not, and it's pure chance. I think people feel very strongly about those things, and maybe they don't frame them in the philosophical language or jargon that academics would use. But I think people are still fundamentally interested in, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? What does it mean what is a family? What is education? Is it just job training, or is it meant to make us moral? What are morals? I don't think that people are necessarily using that language, but people still really care about what their kids learn and what they pass on to the next generation. And, I think people are concerned with their security and the Earth's resources. And I think we can get really far away from the academic language, but wherever you find people, there's going to be real concern and care over life's most important issues, because that's what it means to be human.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So I still use the original logo that you created, which has the line, "A podcast for thinking seekers" on it.
Yeah.
How do you find seekers today? Where do you think seekers are today? Whether online or in person, where are seekers congregating today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I primarily deal in two realms. Because I'm a pastor and because I'm a churchman, I receive seekers in the organization I'm a part of. People come through our doors on a Sunday, or people send us emails, or they call, or they ask for a visit, or I meet them at their point of crisis in their life, and I meet seekers through the institution of the church. And so that's still a very real avenue for me to meet seekers. But then I also think online, through podcasting, through public forums, through social media, through interest pages, through YouTube. I think any content creation website or social media platform or app, I don't think there's any shortage of seekers. I think maybe we have to think about seekers in a little bit different terms than we did in the seeker-sensitive movement. Maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s in the church. We have to think of seekers as simply humans who are curious about the important things of life. I still would like to think that there's still a robust curiosity on college campuses. I don't think it's all gone away, even though there's a lot of doomsday speech about the college campuses and what's happening there, and there certainly is cause for concern. But I still think, when you graduate and you go to college, you still are, you still ought to be a very curious person, and I'm still believing that college students are the hope of the future, and for whatever deficit there is on college campuses, I still think robust dialogue, exposure to new ideas, those things are still happening, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Chad, if you were to pitch Thinker Sensitive to someone, how would you do it?
Well, I would say that I think the audience is really you've got a really good target, Ryan, in that you could catch people in the church who want to think deeper about a lot of the teachings and doctrines and things like that, religious texts like the Bible, that they might not be getting in their church life. And so I think that covers a broad range. So I would make a pitch to them to really, check out Thinker Sensitive, because they can go a little bit deeper in their faith and their equipping. But I also think, Ryan, you have a opportunity to hit a broad secular audience, people who want to hear maybe some theological discourse from a very objective perspective, someone who's careful with their speech, someone who really approaches the material from a perspective of reverence and respect, and taking all different sides and perspectives into account. I think you give a very thoughtful, measured approach to the content you cover. And so, man, I'd pitch it to anybody. I think anybody should be listening to this and joining the conversation with you.
This episode and all episodes of Thinker Sensitive are available on thinkersensitive.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app today to listen to more thought-provoking content from Thinker Sensitive.